Hey everyone! Tonight we're traveling back more than 600 years to a quiet medieval village. Long before messages could be sent in seconds, long before photographs captured smiling faces, and long before anyone could freely choose the person they wished to spend their life with. Tonight we are not becoming a king, a queen, or a famous knight celebrated in songs. Instead, we are ordinary villagers whose lives are shaped by the seasons, the church bell, the harvest, and the expectations of family. Modern stories often imagine medieval romance as something filled with grand castles, secret love letters, elegant dances, and brave knights rescuing beautiful maidens. While those tales certainly existed in poetry and legend, everyday life for ordinary people was very different. For most villagers, love was not the beginning of marriage. More often, marriage came first, and only afterward did couples slowly learn whether affection might grow. Between them during the long years that followed, imagine opening your eyes before sunrise in a small village somewhere in England around the year 1400. The first thing you notice is not the sound of music or cheerful conversation, but the steady crackling of a small fire that has burned throughout the night to keep the cottage from becoming unbearably cold. The room is simple. A wooden table stands near the hearth. Rough benches line the walls. Bundles of herbs hang drying from dark ceiling beams, and several family members still sleep beneath thick wool blankets spread across straw-filled mattresses. Privacy, something many people today consider ordinary, hardly exists here. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes even younger relatives often share the same small living space. In such a world, the quiet dream of secretly falling in love has very little room to grow. Every movement is noticed. Every conversation overheard, and every friendship observed by the people who know you best. As the first pale light begins slipping through the tiny window, the entire household slowly awakens. There is no time to linger comfortably beneath blankets, because another day of work is already waiting outside. Animals must be fed, water carried from the village well, bread prepared, fields tended, fences repaired, and countless other responsibilities completed before sunset. Young men and women certainly see one another during these daily tasks, but opportunities for private conversation remain surprisingly rare. A young woman might pass a neighboring farm while carrying a wooden bucket, exchanging nothing more than a brief smile with a young man repairing a fence. During harvest, entire villages work side by side beneath the summer sun, creating small moments where glances meet across fields of golden grain. These quiet exchanges may seem insignificant, yet in the medieval countryside they often represent the closest thing to courtship that ordinary people experience during much of the year. Even when genuine affection begins growing between two young villagers, another reality quickly appears. Marriage is rarely considered a decision belonging only to the couple themselves. Instead, it becomes a matter involving parents, relatives, neighbors, and the wider community. Families think carefully about land, livestock, financial stability, and reputation long before asking whether two young people truly enjoy each other's company. A hard-working farmer's daughter may be encouraged to marry the son of another respected farming family, because combining resources increases the chance that both households will survive poor harvests and difficult winters. Love is certainly welcomed if it develops naturally, but practical concerns almost always come first. In a world where a single failed harvest can threaten survival, Choosing a husband or wife is often viewed less as a romantic adventure and more as one of the most important economic decisions a family will ever make. During the year, however, there are precious moments when ordinary routines briefly relax, allowing young people opportunities that daily labor rarely provides. Village festivals celebrating successful harvests, important religious feast days, or local fairs transform quiet communities into lively gatherings filled with music, laughter, food, and conversation. Merchants arrive with colorful cloth, pottery, ribbons, and small handmade gifts, while traveling musicians fill the air with cheerful melodies played upon simple medieval instruments. Children race happily between market stalls. Older villagers exchange stories beside long wooden tables, and for a few precious hours the exhausting rhythm of ordinary life slows enough for friendships to grow. It is here, among the gentle excitement of these celebrations, that many young couples first find opportunities to speak without immediately returning to another endless day of work. Even then, conversations remain careful and respectful, because watchful parents and curious neighbors are never very far away. For many young people, the church became one of the few places where they could regularly see someone outside their own household without attracting immediate suspicion. Every Sunday morning, families from scattered farms and neighboring villages slowly gathered along muddy roads leading toward the small stone church standing quietly at the center of the community. Long before the service began, groups of villagers exchanged greetings, while children played beneath ancient oak trees surrounding the churchyard. Elderly men discussed the coming harvest. Blacksmiths spoke about broken tools waiting for repair, and women quietly shared news about births, illnesses, and weddings. Somewhere among this familiar gathering, a young man might briefly notice the same young woman he had secretly admired for months. Their eyes might meet only for a heartbeat before both quickly looked away, careful not to invite unnecessary gossip from neighbors whose curiosity often proved stronger than their kindness. In the modern world, such a brief moment might seem almost meaningless. Yet, in medieval Europe, where opportunities for private meetings were remarkably rare, a single exchanged smile during Sunday worship could remain carefully remembered for the rest of the week. The church itself reminded everyone that marriage was never considered simply a personal decision. Priests spoke frequently about family, duty, faith, and responsibility, encouraging young people to think of marriage as a lifelong promise rather than a romantic adventure. Love was respected, but commitment mattered far more. Divorce, as many people understand it today, was almost impossible for ordinary villagers once two people were joined before God and their community. They were expected to remain together through prosperous harvests, failed harvests, healthy children, heartbreaking losses, sickness, old age, and every hardship waiting between those moments. Such expectations created a completely different understanding of courtship. Choosing the wrong partner could shape the remainder of your entire life, making every decision feel far heavier than a simple matter of affection. Parents understood this responsibility perhaps better than anyone. A father, watching his daughter grow into adulthood, often measured potential husbands by qualities very different from youthful romance. Could the young man work from sunrise until darkness without complaint? Did he care responsibly for animals? Was his family respected within the village? Did they own enough land to survive poor seasons? Had anyone ever questioned his honesty? A mother noticed different details equally important. Was the young woman hard-working around the household? Could she bake bread, preserve food, mend clothing, care for children, and manage daily responsibilities during difficult times? Marriage in medieval Europe joined far more than two individuals. It connected families, land, livestock, future children, and the fragile economic survival of everyone involved. Love might grow later, but stability almost always came first. That did not mean genuine affection failed to exist. On the contrary, countless medieval couples gradually developed deep companionship through years of shared work and quiet sacrifice. Unlike the dramatic romances celebrated by poets, ordinary love often appeared through remarkably simple acts. A husband silently carrying the heaviest bundle of firewood before his wife attempted to lift it herself. A wife saving the largest piece of fresh bread for her husband after noticing how little he had eaten throughout harvest. Two exhausted people sharing a few peaceful moments beside the evening fire. After an impossibly long day, without needing many words at all. These quiet gestures rarely attracted attention from wandering musicians or traveling storytellers. Yet they formed the foundation of countless successful medieval marriages. History often remembers kings and queens. Ordinary love usually survives only through small moments that nobody thought important enough to write down. Occasionally, however, affection faced obstacles that practical planning alone could not overcome. Perhaps a young shepherd quietly fell in love with the daughter of a prosperous miller whose family expected someone wealthier. Perhaps a carpenter admired a girl promised to another family years earlier through informal agreements made by their parents. Differences in wealth, occupation, and local reputation sometimes created invisible barriers stronger than castle walls. Medieval villages were close-knit communities where nearly everyone knew one another's history. A family's good name could open opportunities, while years of poverty or misfortune sometimes closed doors regardless of a person's character. Young people discovered that falling in love required no permission, yet building a future together often depended upon many people beyond themselves. Because of this, patience became an unexpected part of medieval courtship. Relationships rarely moved quickly. Months, sometimes years, passed before families seriously discussed possible marriage. During that time, young couples learned almost everything about one another indirectly. They observed how someone behaved during harvest, whether they treated elderly neighbors kindly, how they responded when storms destroyed crops, and whether they remained dependable through difficult seasons. Character revealed itself gradually through ordinary life rather than dramatic declarations. In many ways, medieval courtship resembled watching a tree grow. No single day appeared remarkable. Yet, over time, quiet consistency proved far more valuable than brief excitement. Winter often became the hardest season for young lovers. Heavy snow, flooded roads, and bitter winds kept families close to home for weeks at a time. Village gatherings became less frequent, market days attracted fewer travelers, and opportunities to meet outside immediate family almost disappeared. A young man might spend long evenings repairing wooden tools beside the fire, while wondering whether the young woman he admired was doing exactly the same thing, only a few fields away. She, meanwhile, might quietly spin wool beside candlelight, while thinking of the brief conversation they shared during the autumn fair months earlier. There were no letters exchanged every evening, no photographs tucked inside pockets, and no quick journeys across frozen countryside. Simply because someone was missed. Waiting became another expression of affection, and patience quietly measured the strength of feelings that neither person could easily express aloud. Yet perhaps that is what made those rare moments together feel so meaningful. A chance conversation beside the village well, walking home from church beneath gentle spring sunshine, standing together during a harvest celebration while musicians played simple melodies beneath colorful banners, sharing fresh apples gathered during autumn or exchanging handmade ribbons purchased from a traveling merchant. Modern romance often moves quickly because opportunities appear almost without limit. Medieval romance moved slowly because every small moment carried extraordinary value. A single afternoon spent talking beneath an ancient oak tree might remain treasured in memory for months, not because anything extraordinary happened, but because such peaceful moments were astonishingly difficult to find in a world where work, family, and responsibility shaped nearly every hour of every day. Marriage discussions almost never began with the young couple themselves. Instead, they usually started quietly between parents who had spent years watching one another's families through changing seasons. Perhaps the conversation happened after Sunday church while the rest of the village slowly walked home beneath bright spring sunshine. Perhaps it began during harvest as two fathers rested briefly beside loaded wagons of grain before returning to work. Sometimes it took place during long winter evenings, when neighbors gathered around warm fires, sharing bread and ale, while discussing the coming year. These conversations rarely sounded romantic. Rather than asking whether two young people loved one another, parents often spoke first about practical matters. How much land would support the new household? Would there be enough sheep or cattle to provide steady income? Could the young man build or inherit a suitable home? Did both families enjoy good reputations within the village? Such questions may seem surprisingly ordinary today, yet in medieval Europe they often determined whether a marriage had any realistic chance of succeeding long before wedding plans were ever imagined. If both families expressed cautious approval, the young couple gradually found themselves spending slightly more time together, though always within the careful eyes of relatives or trusted neighbors. They might work beside one another during harvest, carry water from the village well, or help prepare food for an upcoming religious festival. These shared responsibilities allowed each person to observe qualities impossible to discover during a single conversation. A young woman noticed whether the man remained patient when work became difficult, or whether frustration quickly overcame him after small setbacks. A young man quietly observed whether the woman treated elderly villagers with kindness, cared gently for younger children, and remained dependable even after many exhausting hours of labor. In medieval society, these everyday actions revealed far more about someone's character than elegant words ever could. Love was expected to grow from trust, and trust could only grow through time spent sharing ordinary life together. As weeks slowly turned into months, tiny gestures began carrying enormous emotional meaning. During harvest, a young man might quietly offer to help lift a particularly heavy sack of grain before the young woman had the chance to struggle with it herself. During autumn fairs, he might purchase a simple ribbon or carved wooden token from a traveling merchant, not because it possessed great monetary value, but because it represented several days of carefully saved wages. She in return, might embroider a small piece of cloth or quietly bake fresh bread for his family during an especially busy season. None of these gifts were extravagant. Most would seem almost insignificant by modern standards. Yet each represented hours of honest work, careful planning, and genuine thoughtfulness in a world where nearly every coin had to be spent wisely. Affection often revealed itself not through expensive presents, but through quiet sacrifices willingly made without expecting recognition. Eventually, if both families remained satisfied and no serious objections arose, the possibility of a formal betrothal entered conversation. Unlike modern proposals often filled with surprise and dramatic emotion, medieval betrothals usually unfolded gradually. Everyone involved generally understood the direction events were taking long before any official promises were made. Parents discussed arrangements, relatives offered advice, the local priest ensured no religious obstacles, prevented the union, neighbors, of course, quietly shared opinions, whether invited to do so or not. Medieval villages possessed remarkably little privacy, and news traveled astonishingly quickly from one household to another, before the young couple themselves fully realized that marriage had become likely. Much of the community often suspected exactly what was happening. The engagement itself marked not the joyful ending of uncertainty, but the beginning of entirely new responsibilities. Preparations could continue for many months, while both families worked tirelessly to ensure the future household possessed everything necessary for survival. Clothing had to be sewn almost entirely by hand. Household tools required gathering or crafting. Livestock might be promised as part of family agreements. Grain stores needed careful management so enough food remained available after another mouth joined the household. Even something as ordinary as preparing enough candles for the wedding celebration required weeks of patient work. Medieval weddings were community events, yet behind every joyful gathering stood months of quiet labor performed by countless hands without expecting applause for the bride. These months carried emotions difficult to describe, excitement mixed naturally with uncertainty. She looked forward to beginning a new chapter of life, yet doing so often meant leaving the home where every childhood memory had been formed. The familiar sounds of her parents' cottage, the nearby fields she had walked since infancy, the neighbors who had watched her grow, and even the simple path leading toward the village might soon become places visited only occasionally. Marriage brought hope, but it also required saying goodbye to a world that had shaped every year of her life. Such quiet sadness rarely appears in romantic stories. Yet it must have accompanied countless medieval brides as they prepared for futures filled with both promise and unknown challenges. The groom experienced different worries hidden beneath outward confidence. Providing for another person represented a responsibility far greater than simply working hard in the fields. Every failed harvest, every sick animal, every broken roof, and every harsh winter would now affect not only himself but also the woman, trusting him to help build a secure home together. Medieval husbands carried enormous expectations from both society and family. Strength alone was never enough. Patience, honesty, endurance, and practical wisdom proved equally important. The approaching wedding therefore inspired pride, but also quiet determination to become worthy of the promises soon to be spoken before God, family, and the entire village. Finally, after months of preparation, discussion, and anticipation, the wedding day itself began approaching. Long before sunrise, cottages throughout the village awakened earlier than usual. Bread baked inside warm ovens, fresh herbs decorated simple tables. Children hurried excitedly between neighboring homes carrying small messages, and church bells echoed gently across the countryside announcing that another medieval marriage would soon unite not only to ordinary people, but also to families whose lives would remain connected for generations still waiting to be born. The wedding day itself rarely resembled the lavish celebrations so often portrayed in modern films. For ordinary medieval villagers, the morning began quietly, long before the first guests gathered outside the church. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys as families prepared simple meals before dressing in the finest clothing they owned, garments that were often worn only during the most important occasions of an entire lifetime. These were not sparkling white gowns, embroidered with jewels, or elegant tailored suits made from luxurious fabrics. Most clothing consisted of carefully preserved wool and linen, cleaned as thoroughly as possible, and perhaps decorated with a newly woven ribbon or a small piece of colorful embroidery completed during the long evenings of winter. To modern eyes, the celebration might appear remarkably modest, yet to the people living through it, this was one of the most significant days they would ever experience. It marked not only the beginning of a marriage, but the creation of an entirely new household that would hopefully endure through decades of harvests, winters, joys, disappointments, births, illnesses, and old age. As families slowly made their way toward the village church, the narrow paths filled with familiar faces greeting one another warmly. Elderly neighbors who had watched the bride and groom grow from childhood smiled with quiet satisfaction, remembering the first time they had seen them chasing one another through village fields many years earlier. Young children laughed while gathering wildflowers growing beside hedgerows, proudly carrying small bunches that would later decorate simple wooden tables prepared for the celebration. Farmers temporarily left behind unfinished work in the fields. Blacksmiths allowed their fires to cool for a single morning. Shepherds entrusted their flocks to younger relatives. Whenever possible, and even travelers passing through the village sometimes paused to witness the ceremony. Medieval communities rarely experienced occasions that brought everyone together in such a peaceful way, making weddings important not only for the couple but for the entire village itself. Inside the cool stone church, sunlight entered through narrow windows, falling gently across worn flagstones polished smooth by generations of footsteps. The familiar scent of beeswax candles mixed softly with the fragrance of fresh herbs and flowers placed near the altar earlier that morning. The priest waited patiently while family members quietly filled the wooden benches, speaking only in gentle whispers that quickly faded into respectful silence. Unlike modern ceremonies where hundreds of photographs preserve every expression, medieval weddings existed only within the memories of those fortunate enough to witness them. Every smile, every nervous glance, every spoken promise disappeared into history the moment it happened, carried forward only through stories shared with children and grandchildren in the years that followed. When the bride finally entered the church, she was rarely alone. Close relatives accompanied her with quiet dignity, understanding that this short walk represented far more than a simple procession. Each step carried her farther from the household where she had spent her entire childhood and closer toward a completely different life waiting just beyond the church doors. Her parents watched with emotions that were surely both joyful and bittersweet. They celebrated the beginning of their daughter's future while quietly recognizing that the familiar rhythms of family life had already begun changing forever. The groom stood waiting nearby, perhaps appearing calm on the outside, yet almost certainly carrying his own mixture of excitement, gratitude, uncertainty, and responsibility. In only a few moments he would promise before God and his entire community to protect, support, and remain faithful to another person for the remainder of his life. The ceremony itself was often simple compared with modern expectations, yet its meaning reached deeply into every corner of medieval society. Promises spoken before the priest were understood as sacred obligations extending far beyond personal happiness. Marriage joined two families, strengthened village relationships, and created the foundation upon which future generations would be raised. Everyone present understood that life ahead would not always be easy. Harvests would fail from time to time. Winters would bring hunger. Illness might visit without warning. Children would be born into a world where survival could never be guaranteed. Yet the vows spoken that morning acknowledged all these possibilities while still choosing hope over uncertainty. Perhaps that quiet courage explains why medieval marriage carried such profound importance. It was never a promise that life would become easier. It was a promise that whatever difficulties arrived, they would be faced together. Once the ceremony ended, the atmosphere outside the church changed almost immediately. Serious expressions softened into broad smiles as bells rang joyfully across the countryside. Friends and relatives gathered around the newly married couple, offering warm congratulations, heartfelt blessings, and practical gifts intended to help them begin their shared life. These presents were rarely luxurious. A sturdy cooking pot, a well-crafted wooden chest, hand-woven blankets, carefully embroidered linen, useful farming tools, or perhaps a healthy chicken, goat, or sheep often meant far more than objects valued only for beauty. Every gift reflected the practical reality of medieval existence. Rather than decorating a home, they helped create one. Each item quietly expressed the community's hope that the young couple would build a household capable of surviving whatever the coming years might bring. The celebration that followed became one of the happiest occasions many villagers experienced throughout the entire year. Long wooden tables were arranged outdoors whenever the weather allowed, covered with freshly baked bread, vegetable stews, roasted meats if the family could afford them, soft cheeses, apples, onions, ale, and simple cakes sweetened with precious honey. Traveling musicians filled the air with lively melodies played upon fiddles, flutes, bagpipes, and small drums, while children laughed freely, chasing one another between tables until exhausted parents finally called them back. Older villagers shared stories of weddings from decades earlier, comparing memories that had grown warmer with every passing year. For a single afternoon, worries about taxes, difficult harvests, aching backs, and approaching winters quietly stepped aside, allowing an ordinary community to celebrate something far more powerful than wealth or status. They celebrated hope itself, the hope that two young people beginning their lives together might one day grow old side by side, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and countless quiet memories created not through grand adventures, but through the ordinary kindness shared across many peaceful years. The joyful celebration continued long after the church bells had fallen silent. As the afternoon slowly drifted toward evening, The entire village seemed transformed into a place where ordinary worries had been carefully set aside, if only for a single precious day. Laughter carried across the open fields. Musicians continued playing familiar melodies that everyone had heard since childhood, and children ran endlessly between long wooden tables while elderly villagers smiled quietly, remembering weddings from many decades before. For the bride and groom, however, the celebration passed almost like a dream. Everywhere they turned, another neighbor wished them happiness. Another relative offered advice, and another friend raised a wooden cup filled with ale in their honor. It was perhaps the only day in their entire lives when the whole village gathered not because of danger, harvest, or religious obligation, but simply to celebrate hope. For two ordinary people beginning an uncertain future together. As daylight slowly softened into the warm colors of evening, dancing often began upon the open grass beside the cottages. There were no magnificent ballrooms illuminated by crystal chandeliers as modern imagination sometimes suggests. Instead, villagers formed simple circles while musicians played lively tunes upon fiddles, pipes, and small drums. Young couples laughed together while older husbands and wives occasionally joined the dances themselves, proving that even after decades of marriage there remained moments of quiet happiness worth celebrating. Watching them, the newly married couple caught a rare glimpse of what their own future might become. They saw weathered hands still held gently after many years, quiet smiles exchanged without words, and comfortable companionship built not during a single romantic afternoon, but through thousands of ordinary days shared side by side. Perhaps this, more than anything else, offered the greatest lesson about medieval love. Romance did not end with marriage. In many ways, it only truly began afterward. Eventually, the guests began returning home beneath skies glowing orange and deep purple above the village rooftops. One by one, candles disappeared into distant cottages, while musicians packed away their instruments and tired children finally surrendered to sleep. Upon their parents' shoulders, the celebration gradually faded into peaceful silence until only a few close relatives remained to help tidy tables and carry leftover food indoors. For the bride and groom, however, another completely unfamiliar chapter was only beginning. Tomorrow morning they would awaken not as the daughter or son of separate households, but as husband and wife, sharing the same responsibilities for the very first time. The excitement of the wedding slowly gave way to the quiet realization that everyday life, with all its ordinary challenges, would soon begin. Unlike modern honeymoon traditions involving distant travel and weeks of relaxation, medieval newlyweds usually returned almost immediately to ordinary work. Crops continued growing, whether someone had been married yesterday or not. Animals still required feeding before sunrise. Bread still needed baking. Water still had to be carried from the village well. And firewood still demanded gathering before cold evenings arrived. Romance existed, not apart from daily responsibilities, but within them. A husband helping repair the roof before autumn rain arrived. A wife preparing warm food after her husband's exhausting day in the fields. Both working together to plant next season's crops. These simple routines gradually became the language through which affection quietly expressed itself year after year. The first months of marriage often required careful adjustment from both husband and wife. Two people raised in different households discovered that familiar routines were not always identical. One family baked bread differently than another. One household rose slightly earlier before sunrise. One stored grain in larger barrels, while another preferred woven baskets. Even small habits, unnoticed throughout childhood, suddenly became visible when two lives joined beneath one roof. Such differences occasionally caused frustration, yet they also encouraged patience. Successful medieval marriages depended less upon grand romantic gestures and far more upon the willingness to listen, adapt, forgive small mistakes, and continue working together despite inevitable disagreements. Love gradually revealed itself not through perfection, but through the quiet decision to remain kind even when life became difficult. Money, or more accurately, the lack of it, influenced nearly every aspect of married life. Most ordinary families possessed little beyond their clothing, simple furniture, farming tools, a few animals, and perhaps a small piece of land. Every loaf of bread represented hours of labor. Every candle burned too quickly for comfort. Every broken tool meant another expense. Few households welcomed, because resources remained limited. Husband and wife quickly learned the importance of cooperation. Wasting food, neglecting repairs, or ignoring responsibilities affected not just personal comfort, but the survival of the entire household. In such circumstances, affection often grew strongest between couples who viewed themselves not as two separate individuals, but as partners facing the same uncertain future together. As seasons passed, many couples experienced one of the happiest and most challenging moments of medieval family life: the arrival of children. The birth of a healthy baby filled cottages with extraordinary joy, yet it also brought enormous responsibility. Mothers continued caring for households while raising infants, often with help from grandmothers, sisters, or neighboring women who had already experienced childbirth themselves. Fathers worked even harder than before, knowing additional mouths depended entirely upon successful harvests and healthy livestock. Nights became shorter, worries became greater, yet many parents quietly accepted these sacrifices because they hoped their children might one day inherit not wealth or titles, but something equally valuable: a loving, hard-working family capable of facing life's hardships together. Years slowly passed, almost without anyone noticing. The young couple admired during the wedding gradually became experienced members of the community themselves. Their hair began showing the first signs of grey, their hands grew rougher from decades of honest labor, and younger villagers now looked toward them for guidance, just as they had once looked toward older generations. Together they celebrated good harvests, mourned difficult losses, survived bitter winters, welcomed grandchildren into the family, and watched the village itself slowly change around them. Their love no longer depended upon youthful excitement or shy glances exchanged across churchyards. Instead, it had become something quieter, steadier, and perhaps far stronger: companionship shaped by thousands of ordinary mornings, shared meals, difficult decisions, silent understanding, and unwavering loyalty. Perhaps that is the greatest difference between medieval love and the romantic stories many of us imagine today. The poems of wandering minstrels spoke of impossible beauty, heroic rescues, and dramatic declarations beneath castle balconies. Ordinary villagers experienced something much humbler, yet arguably much more enduring. Their love appeared in shared work beneath the summer sun, in warm bread waiting after exhausting days, in repaired roofs before winter storms, in comforting words whispered beside sickbeds, and in faithful companionship lasting through every season life placed before them. It was rarely spectacular enough for history books, but it was real, deeply human, and quietly beautiful. So as night settles gently over our medieval village, imagine the newly married couple closing the wooden door of their small cottage for the very first time as husband and wife. Outside, the last voices of departing guests fade into the distance, while the church bell marks another peaceful evening. A small fire glows softly within the hearth, casting warm light across rough wooden walls that will soon witness countless ordinary days filled with laughter, worry, hope, disappointment, and quiet joy. Beyond the tiny window, stars slowly appear above sleeping fields exactly as they have for countless generations before. Tomorrow will bring more work, more responsibilities, and undoubtedly more challenges. Yet tonight, beneath that simple roof, two ordinary people begin building a life together, not through fairy tales or impossible romance, but through patience, trust, kindness, and the quiet promise to face whatever the future holds, side by side, and with that peaceful image resting gently in your mind. Allow the sounds of the medieval village to drift farther into the distance. Let the warmth of the fire soften your thoughts, and slowly drift into a deep and restful sleep beneath the same timeless stars that watched over countless ordinary love stories throughout the Middle Ages. The years continue passing almost unnoticed, because medieval life has a quiet way of measuring time differently than the modern world. Instead of calendars hanging upon walls or clocks marking every passing hour, the rhythm of life is measured through harvests, winters, church festivals, and the changing colors of the countryside. Before long, the young couple who once stood nervously before the village priest no longer think of themselves as newly married at all. They wake before sunrise without needing to speak, each already knowing the countless small tasks waiting beyond the cottage door. While one quietly stirs the fire back to life after the cold night, the other prepares tools needed for another day in the fields. Their movements have become almost perfectly synchronized, not because they planned them carefully, but because years of living together have slowly taught them one another's habits better than words ever could. This quiet understanding is perhaps the greatest gift marriage eventually offers. A companionship built through thousands of ordinary mornings rather than dramatic moments remembered by history. As children grow older, the cottage becomes louder than either parent could have imagined on their wedding day. Tiny footsteps race across rough wooden floors before sunrise. Curious questions interrupt evening meals, and laughter echoes through the small home. While younger brothers and sisters invent games using little more than sticks, stones, and endless imagination. The parents often watch these simple moments with quiet satisfaction despite their constant exhaustion. Medieval childhood is filled with responsibilities far earlier than modern children might expect, yet there remains room for joy among daily work. Young boys gradually accompany their fathers into fields or workshops, learning how to guide oxen, repair fences, sharpen tools, and judge weather simply by watching clouds drift across the horizon. Young girls spend long afternoons beside mothers and grandmothers, learning how to bake bread, spin wool, preserve food for winter, care for younger siblings, and manage a household where almost nothing can ever be wasted. Knowledge passes naturally from one generation to the next, not through written lessons, but through patient observation repeated every single day. Marriage also teaches couples something few people consider while celebrating their wedding: Love changes as people themselves change. The shy young man who once struggled to speak confidently beside the village well slowly becomes a father whose children depend entirely upon his judgment. The nervous young bride who quietly left her childhood home grows into a wise woman whose advice younger wives now seek whenever difficult questions arise. Faces become lined by years beneath the sun. Hands grow rough from endless labor, and hair slowly loses the dark colors of youth. Yet beneath these outward changes, something else quietly strengthens. Affection becomes calmer, steadier, and far less concerned with appearances. A husband no longer admires only the beauty that first caught his attention during harvest festivals many years before. He admires the strength shown after sleepless nights caring for sick children, the patience displayed through failed harvests, and the quiet courage that helped the family survive every hardship placed before them. She, in turn, no longer sees only the hopeful young farmer standing beside the church altar. She sees the man who repaired leaking roofs before every storm, carried heavy burdens without complaint, comforted frightened children during harsh winters, and remained faithful through every uncertainty life delivered. Their love has become woven into the ordinary fabric of daily existence so completely that neither can imagine life unfolding any other way. Not every year brings happiness. Medieval life is marked by loss as surely as it is by celebration. Some winters prove cruel beyond expectation, freezing crops before they can be harvested and leaving families wondering whether stored grain will last until spring. Illness arrives unexpectedly, spreading through villages where medical knowledge remains painfully limited. Friends who danced joyfully together at weddings are sometimes mourned only a few years later beneath the quiet bells of the same village church. Parents experience the heartbreaking loss of children, husbands bury beloved wives, and wives learn to continue raising families after losing the partners who once shared every burden beside them. Such grief becomes an unavoidable part of medieval existence. Yet even during these darkest seasons, communities rarely allow anyone to suffer entirely alone. Neighbors quietly bring bread to grieving households. Relatives help gather harvests when illness prevents work. And the simple act of sharing another family's burden becomes one of the greatest expressions of love a village can offer. Through all these changing years, the church remains a constant presence within village life. It witnesses baptisms, marriages, funerals, harvest festivals, and prayers offered during both joyful and desperate times. The same stone walls that echoed with wedding vows decades earlier now hear the whispered gratitude of elderly couples who have somehow reached old age together despite every challenge placed before them. Sitting quietly upon familiar wooden benches, they sometimes glance toward younger couples standing nervously where they themselves once stood so many years before. Perhaps they smiled gently, remembering how uncertain the future once seemed. If they could speak honestly to those young newlyweds, they might explain that the secret to a lasting marriage was never hidden inside grand romantic gestures. Instead, it lived quietly within thousands of ordinary decisions made every single day. Choosing patience instead of anger, choosing forgiveness instead of pride, choosing kindness even when exhaustion made it difficult, choosing to remain beside one another long after youthful excitement had naturally faded into something quieter but infinitely stronger. By the time old age finally arrives, the couple's lives have become deeply connected not only to each other but also to the history of the village itself. They remember cottages that no longer stand, children who have grown into parents themselves, ancient trees planted when they were young, and harvests still spoken about decades later because they were either wonderfully abundant or painfully poor, sitting together outside their small home during warm summer evenings. They watch grandchildren chase one another across the same fields where they once exchanged shy glances as nervous young villagers. The world has changed around them, yet some things remain beautifully familiar. Church bells still echo across the countryside every Sunday morning. Swallows still return each spring to build nests beneath cottage roofs. Wheat still turns golden beneath the summer sun before harvest finally begins. Life continues moving forward exactly as it always has, carrying one generation gently into the next. Perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden beneath ordinary medieval love. It was never perfect, never effortless, and certainly never free from sorrow. Yet it possessed a remarkable strength, born not from fantasy, but from shared responsibility. While poets celebrated impossible romances between noble knights and distant princesses, countless ordinary husbands and wives built something equally meaningful within humble cottages scattered across Europe. They raised families, survived hardships, laughed during peaceful evenings, mourned heartbreaking losses, and slowly discovered that the deepest forms of love often grow not through extraordinary adventures, but through thousands of simple days faithfully lived together. Their names have long disappeared from history, their homes have returned to the earth, and even the paths they once walked have faded beneath centuries of changing seasons, yet their quiet stories remain every bit as important as those of kings and queens, reminding us that history has always been shaped not only by famous people, but also by ordinary couples who chose day after day to build hopeful lives together beneath the endless medieval sky. Even after many decades of marriage, there are still quiet moments that remind the elderly couple of the shy young man and young woman they once were. Early one spring morning, before the village has fully awakened, they step outside together as they have done thousands of times before. The air is cool and carries the familiar scent of damp earth, blossoming hawthorn, and wood smoke rising lazily from neighboring cottages. Birds sing from the hedgerows exactly as they did on the morning of their wedding so many years ago. Their movements are slower now, their backs slightly bent from a lifetime of labor. Yet there is a peaceful comfort in the silence they share. They no longer need endless conversations to understand one another. A simple glance, a gentle smile, or the quiet offer of a steady hand while crossing uneven ground says more than the longest speech ever could. This quiet companionship, patiently built over an entire lifetime, has become the truest form of love either of them has ever known. Around them, the village continues changing as every new generation grows. Young couples now stand where they once stood, nervously exchanging shy smiles during church festivals and wondering what the future might hold. Children who once played beside their own sons and daughters have become parents themselves, guiding another generation through the same narrow streets. The same fields and the same changing seasons. The elderly husband often notices a young shepherd walking beside a girl carrying water from the village well and quietly smiles to himself. He remembers doing exactly the same thing many decades earlier, pretending to admire the weather while secretly hoping for just a few extra moments of conversation. His wife notices the same scene and smiles as well, understanding immediately what memory has returned to him. without either of them speaking a single word. Time has transformed them from nervous lovers into living memories of a past that younger villagers can scarcely imagine. The greatest wealth they possess is not measured in coins, livestock, or acres of land. It lives instead within countless ordinary memories gathered throughout the years. They remember the tiny cottage they repaired together after their first harsh winter. They remember carrying their first child through the village church for baptism, while proudly introducing the newest member of their family to friends and neighbors. They remember evenings spent sitting beside the fire, while rain tapped gently against the thatched roof overhead. They remember frightening winters when food became scarce, joyful harvests when the fields overflowed with grain, and peaceful summer nights when they sat quietly outside watching thousands of stars appear above the countryside. None of these moments would ever become famous beyond the village. Yet together they formed a life richer than either of them could have imagined on the morning they exchanged wedding vows. There were difficult years too, years that tested every promise spoken before the altar. Storms destroyed crops only weeks before harvest. Illness visited the household without warning, leaving everyone fearful that loved ones might never recover. Livestock died during especially cruel winters, despite months of careful preparations. Some neighbors left the village forever in search of better opportunities elsewhere, while others were buried beneath simple stone markers after lives of honest labor came peacefully to an end. During every hardship, husband and wife discovered something important about love. Real affection was not measured by happiness during easy times, but by loyalty during difficult ones. Standing beside another person when everything feels uncertain required a quiet courage far greater than the dramatic romances celebrated by wandering poets. As old age slowly settles upon them, work naturally becomes lighter. Younger hands now lift the heaviest sacks of grain, repair the tallest roofs, and guide the strongest oxen across freshly plowed fields. The elderly couple spend more time teaching than doing, patiently showing grandchildren how to recognize changing weather by studying the clouds, how to bake bread that remains fresh throughout winter, how to care for animals with kindness rather than impatience, and perhaps most importantly, how to treat neighbors with generosity, because someday everyone depends upon someone else's help. These lessons are never written inside books. They pass quietly from one generation to the next, through ordinary conversations shared beside warm fires, during evening meals, or while walking familiar village paths that have connected families. For centuries, sometimes on peaceful evenings, the couple walks slowly toward the small hill overlooking the village, where they can see nearly everything that shaped their lives. Below them stand the cottages where friends still prepare supper. Beyond them stretch fields that have fed countless families through changing seasons. The church bell rings softly in the distance, just as it did on the day they first promised to share their lives together. Swallows circle above the rooftops, before disappearing into nests tucked beneath weathered beams, while sheep graze quietly upon distant hills glowing beneath the last golden light of sunset. Entire landscape feels wonderfully familiar. Every tree, every footpath, every meadow carries memories layered gently upon one another until the countryside itself seems almost alive with stories. Perhaps this is why medieval love, despite all its hardships and limitations, possessed a remarkable depth that is easy to overlook today. It grew slowly, patiently, and often without dramatic moments worthy of songs or legends. It was strengthened by shared work, quiet sacrifice, mutual respect, and the willingness to remain faithful through every season of life. It survived not because life was easy, but because two ordinary people chose again and again to face every challenge together. Their greatest adventure was never a heroic quest across distant kingdoms. It was waking beside the same person for 40 or 50 years, sharing both joy and sorrow until each became impossible to separate from the other. And so, as our journey through medieval love gently draws toward its peaceful conclusion, imagine the village settling once more beneath the quiet embrace of night. Candles flicker softly behind tiny cottage windows. The last voices fade into comfortable silence. Somewhere in the distance, an owl calls from the edge of an ancient forest, while a cool evening breeze moves gently across fields that have witnessed countless ordinary lives unfold beneath the same endless sky. The elderly couple quietly returns home, closing the familiar wooden door that has welcomed them every evening for decades. Inside, the fire burns low, casting warm light across worn wooden furniture, polished smooth by generations of careful hands. They sit together for a little while longer without needing to speak, content simply to share the peaceful silence they spent an entire lifetime creating together. Outside, the stars continue shining above medieval Europe exactly as they did on the night they first dreamed of a future together. And as those timeless stars slowly fill the heavens, allow yourself to drift peacefully into sleep, carrying with you the gentle reminder that history's greatest love stories were not always those of kings and queens, but often belonged to ordinary people whose quiet devotion endured through every changing season of life. As the final years of their lives quietly unfold, the elderly husband and wife come to understand something that neither of them could possibly have imagined on the day they first met as nervous young villagers. Love was never truly found during a single conversation beside the village well, nor was it created entirely on their wedding day beneath the stone arches of the church. Instead, it had been patiently built one ordinary day at a time. Every loaf of bread they baked together. Every difficult winter they survived. Every child they raised. Every harvest they celebrated. Every sorrow they quietly endured. And every peaceful evening spent beside the same small fire had become another carefully placed stone in a foundation stronger than either of them ever realized while they were living through those moments. Looking back, they no longer remember every conversation or every festival, yet they clearly remember how it always felt to know that whatever tomorrow might bring, they would never have to face it alone. One quiet autumn afternoon, they decide to take one final slow walk through the village before the coming winter arrives. Their pace is much slower than it once was, but neither seems concerned about reaching any particular destination. They simply enjoy revisiting the places that quietly witnessed the story of their lives. They pass the old village well, where they once exchanged shy greetings while pretending not to notice one. Another, they smile as they walk beside the small church where they promised before God and their neighbors to remain faithful through every season of life. They pause near the meadow where harvest festivals were once filled with music, dancing and laughter, remembering faces that have long since disappeared from the world but remain wonderfully alive inside their memories. Every corner of the village seems to whisper another forgotten story, another quiet reminder that ordinary places often become extraordinary simply because of the lives lived within them. As they continue walking, younger villagers greet them warmly with genuine respect. Children wave excitedly while their parents pause to exchange friendly conversation. Many of these young families know the elderly couple not because of wealth, noble titles, or remarkable achievements, but because they have become living examples of patience, kindness, and quiet devotion. Newly married husbands often seek the old man's advice before difficult planting seasons, while young wives ask the elderly woman how she managed to raise children, survive harsh winters, and keep hope alive through years when almost everything seemed uncertain. Neither of them considers themselves especially wise. They simply answer honestly, explaining that no marriage remains joyful every single day, no family escapes hardship forever, and no life unfolds exactly as anyone first imagined. What truly matters, they gently explain, is learning to walk through difficult days together rather than expecting those difficult days never to arrive. That evening, as the sun slowly disappears beyond the distant hills, they return once more to the familiar bench outside their little cottage. Before them stretches the same countryside that has accompanied every chapter of their lives. Sheep graze peacefully upon rolling hills glowing beneath the last golden light. Thin trails of smoke rise gently from neighboring cottages where evening meals are already being prepared. The church bell rings softly across the valley, followed by the distant laughter of children finishing one last game before darkness settles over the village. Everything feels peaceful. Everything feels complete. The world continues moving forward exactly as it always has, welcoming new beginnings while quietly honoring those who came before. As darkness finally covers the medieval countryside, thousands of brilliant stars slowly appear overhead, shining with astonishing clarity above fields untouched by the bright lights of the modern world. The elderly couple sit quietly together, saying very little. They no longer feel the need to fill every silence with conversation because the greatest conversations of their lives have already taken place across countless ordinary years. Sometimes the old man gently reaches for his wife's hand, not because he fears she might disappear, but simply because after so many decades the gesture has become as natural as breathing. She smiles softly without looking away from the stars, understanding perfectly why he reached for her hand before he speaks a single word. In that simple moment exists the quiet ending of a love story that never depended upon dramatic speeches, impossible adventures, or fairy tale miracles. It depended instead upon faithfulness repeated every day for an entire lifetime. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson medieval history quietly offers us tonight. When we imagine the Middle Ages, our thoughts often rush toward towering castles, glittering crowns, armored knights, and famous battles that changed kingdoms forever. Yet those remarkable events touched only a tiny fraction of the population. Most people experienced history very differently. They fell in love beside village wells, married inside humble stone churches, raised families within small timber cottages, worked endlessly through changing seasons, and slowly grew old together beneath the same endless sky. Their names were never written inside royal chronicles. No statues were carved in their honor. No songs celebrated their ordinary lives, and yet, without them, medieval Europe could never have existed. Their quiet love, honest labor, unwavering patience, and simple hope became the invisible foundation upon which every village, every town, and every kingdom quietly stood. So tonight, as our peaceful journey through medieval love gently comes to an end, imagine one final scene before sleep finally carries you away. A small village rests beneath the silver glow of the moon. The last candle inside the old couple's cottage slowly burns lower, while the fire in the hearth fades into glowing embers. Outside, the wind moves gently through ancient oak trees exactly as it has for centuries. Sheep rest peacefully within their wooden fold. Horses sleep quietly inside nearby stables, and somewhere far beyond the fields, a lone owl calls softly into the still night air. Tomorrow morning, another generation will wake before sunrise, ring the church bell, carry water from the village well, tend the fields, and perhaps, somewhere among those ordinary moments, another shy young man and another quiet young woman will exchange a smile that begins a story remarkably similar to the one we have shared tonight. History will continue, seasons will continue, and love quiet, patient, imperfect, yet deeply enduring will continue as well, just as it always has beneath the timeless stars of medieval Europe. And now, with the village finally asleep, the fires burning low, and the peaceful countryside wrapped gently in silence, it's time for us to leave this quiet corner of the Middle Ages behind. Thank you for joining me on this slow journey through the ordinary lives of ordinary people whose stories are so often forgotten. Close your eyes, relax your thoughts, breathe slowly, and allow the gentle sounds of the medieval night to carry you peacefully into a deep and restful sleep. Good night, and until our next journey back through history, sleep well.